You invited me to your wedding after kicking me out for her? He chose me. You're nothing. This is the man you mocked, the billionaire owner of your company.
No, that's impossible, please!
You are both a disgrace. Get out!
He kicked her out with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a shattered heart. But he had the audacity to send her a gold-embossed wedding invitation 6 months later, addressed to the shelter where she now slept. She was his ex-wife, poor, discarded, replaced. But before we talk about her, we need to talk about the woman he replaced her with. The rich, arrogant mistress had one unbreakable rule she lived by every single day: never acknowledge anyone beneath her. She enforced it at galas. She enforced it in boardrooms. She enforced it in the gleaming lobby of the $70 billion company she worked for, sweeping past janitors without a glance, publicly humiliating a delivery man in front of colleagues who stood frozen in second-hand shame. And once, on a cold Tuesday morning, having a homeless man physically removed from the steps outside the building because, she told security with a perfectly manicured wave of her hand, he was bad for the company's image. She stepped over him on Mondays. She reported him on Wednesdays. She never once looked at his face. But if she had stopped for even 5 seconds and looked into those quiet, intelligent, watchful eyes, she would have recognized him from the cover of Forbes magazine, from the head of the boardroom table, from the signature on every paycheck she had ever received. Because that homeless man on those steps, he didn't just work for the $70 billion company. He owned it. But he wasn't sitting on those steps by accident. He was watching. He was always watching, studying character, the way most billionaires study balance sheets, because he had learned long ago that a person's true worth is never revealed in a boardroom. It is revealed in how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them. And there was one person who passed those steps every morning who always stopped. She never came in a luxury car. She came on foot, in worn shoes that had outlived their season, carrying a small container of whatever she had managed to prepare the night before, but she always came, every morning, without fail, without expectation, without knowing, even for a single second, who he really was. She was the ex-wife, the one her ex-husband had called too poor, too plain, too small for the life he believed he deserved, the one he had kicked out to make room for his rich, arrogant mistress on the same evening he changed the locks, the one who went from a warm home to a shelter cot in less than 24 hours, but who never once, not on her worst morning, stopped feeding a stranger who had even less. God sees everything, child, the homeless man told her quietly one fog-covered morning as she pressed the warm container into his hands. She smiled and thought it was comfort, but it was prophecy. Because across the city, someone else had been watching too, someone who had been silent for 6 months, who had flown across the country in quiet fury the day her son chose his mistress over his wife, who had spent those 6 months searching, discovering, and uncovering a truth so staggering that when she finally found the right moment to act, she didn't send a message. She boarded a billionaire's jet. His mother arrived at that wedding the way justice always arrives, not loudly, not early, but precisely on time, seated beside the most powerful man in the room, stepping through those wedding doors in a moment that witnesses would later struggle to describe without their voices breaking. The groom's own mother, on a billionaire's jet, with the homeless man he had stepped over, dressed now in a suit that cost more than the wedding venue. The room stopped breathing. The ex-husband saw him first, and what he did in that moment was something no one who was there would ever forget. Then the mistress turned, and when she recognized the face of the man she had ordered removed from the sidewalk, the man whose company paid her salary, approved her title, and owned the very building she had performed her arrogance in, what she did was unthinkable. But the question that will stay with you long after this story ends is not what they did. It is what his mother did, and why she chose that exact moment, and what she said to her son, quietly, slowly, looking him directly in the eyes, that made grown men in that room look away. This is a story about what happens when a good woman is underestimated by everyone except the one person who mattered most. It is a story about the kind of arrogance that digs its own grave and the kind of kindness that builds its own throne. It is a story about karma so precise, so beautifully timed, that you will finish it and sit in silence for a moment before you can speak. What would you have done if you were her, handed a trash bag and a shelter cot by the man you loved? Would you have fed that homeless man? Would you have shown up to that wedding? Dear viewers, this story will teach you something that no school ever puts on a curriculum, that how you treat people when you have nothing reveals everything about who you truly are, and that the universe keeps a record that no one can delete. You will learn why kindness is never weakness, why arrogance always carries an expiration date, and why the people the world overlooks are often the ones holding the keys to everything. Watch till the very end, because every scene will surprise you. Drop in the comments the biggest lesson you take away, and tell me, what would you have done differently if you were in her shoes? Subscribe now for more stories that entertain, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. The shelter on Greystone Avenue smelled like industrial detergent and reheated soup, but to Eleanor Briggs, it had become the most honest place she had ever lived. Honest because no one here pretended. No one dressed up disappointment in expensive packaging or smiled at you while planning your removal. The women on her row of cots had lost things, husbands, houses, health, hope, but none of them had lost the ability to look each other in the eye, and Eleanor had come to understand, in the quiet humiliation of her first weeks there, that eye contact was a luxury she had taken for granted her entire married life. She had been married for 7 years to Daniel Briggs. 7 years of building, of working double shifts at the hospital records office while he climbed the corporate ladder she had believed was theirs together, of skipping vacations so they could invest in the townhouse on Carmichael Street, of ironing his shirts at 5 a.m. and leaving his coffee on the counter before she slipped out the door. 7 years of being the quiet foundation beneath a man who, it turned out, had been building something else entirely, a second life, a polished and glamorous parallel existence with a woman named Victoria Channing, who was everything Daniel had decided Eleanor was not. Victoria was a senior executive at Hargrove and Stone, one of the most prestigious firms in the country, housed in a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that made people feel important just by walking through its doors. She wore her success the way some people wear weapons. She had once told Daniel, in the early weeks of their affair, in words he later repeated to Eleanor during the conversation that ended their marriage, that a man of his potential deserved a woman who matches his ceiling, not one who is comfortable with his floor. Eleanor had stood very still when he said that, but something inside her, something she would not identify for months, quietly noted every single word. The divorce was swift. Daniel had a lawyer. Eleanor had a legal aid volunteer with a broken briefcase clasp. The townhouse on Carmichael Street, the one she had scrubbed and painted and mortgaged her weekends for, went to Daniel, because Victoria had already moved her things into the master bedroom before the papers were signed, and possession, as Eleanor's volunteer lawyer explained with genuine apology, carried weight in these proceedings. She left with a trash bag. Daniel held the door open. He did not meet her eyes, but he did check his watch, because Victoria had made a dinner reservation and he didn't want to be late. That was 6 months ago. Now Eleanor sat on her shelter cot on a Tuesday morning in November, holding a gold-embossed envelope that had been delivered to the front desk, addressed in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. The same careful, architectural script she had once found charming, the same hand that had signed the divorce papers without trembling. She opened it slowly. Mr. Daniel Briggs and Ms. Victoria Channing request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. Saturday, the 14th, at the Grand Callaway Hotel. She read it 3 times, but she did not cry. She had used up that particular resource in the first month. And what had replaced, it was something quieter and far more durable, a kind of cellular clarity, a stripping away of every illusion she had ever held about who Daniel Briggs actually was. What she felt, sitting on that cot with the gold envelope in her worn hands, was something closer to recognition. Of course, some deep part of her said, of course he did. She set the invitation on the cot beside her and reached for the small container she had prepared the night before, rice and black beans, seasoned carefully with what little she had, wrapped it in a cloth, and pulled on her coat. Because it was morning, and morning meant the steps outside Hargrove and Stone. She had first noticed the homeless man 3 months ago, sitting on the granite steps of the glass tower on Meridian Avenue, wrapped in a grey blanket, never aggressive, never loud, just present in the particular way that truly still people are present, as though they are watching something the rest of the world is moving too fast to see. She had stopped without thinking. She had offered what she had. He had accepted with a dignity so complete it had momentarily disoriented her, because it was the dignity of a man who was doing her a favor by receiving. She had come back the next morning, but she still did not know his name. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined standing there on those cold granite steps with her container of rice and beans, was that the man beneath the grey blanket had, just 3 years prior, signed the deed that made him the sole owner of Hargrove and Stone. And he had not forgotten a single morning she had come. His name was Theodore Weston, but the world that mattered called him Theo, and the world that didn't know him called him nothing at all, which was precisely the point. 3 years ago, Theodore Weston had walked out of the glass tower on Meridian Avenue in a $4,000 suit, stepped into a waiting car, and disappeared from public life so completely that his own board of directors had spent 6 weeks in emergency session trying to locate him. The press had theories. The financial blogs had wilder ones, but the truth was far simpler and far more devastating than any of them had imagined. He had lost his son. Marcus, no, the boy's name was Colin. Colin Weston, 24 years old, bright as a solar flare, with his father's watchful eyes and his mother's stubborn laugh. Colin had been killed by a drunk driver on the interstate on a Wednesday evening in October. Returning from a job interview, he had insisted on attending without his father's connections, because he wanted, more than anything, to know that what he built was his own. Theodore had stood at that graveside in the rain and felt the $70 billion mean nothing, less than nothing. He had built an empire with these hands, but he had not been holding his son's hand when it mattered. He had been in a boardroom in Singapore, closing a deal that added another wing to an already incomprehensible fortune, while Colin drove alone on an October interstate and never came home. The grief did not break Theodore Weston, but it rearranged him entirely. He had spent the first month in his penthouse, surrounded by the architecture of success, the art, the views, the silence that expensive things maintain, and understood for the first time that he had built a monument to achievement and forgotten to build a life inside it. He had given Colin everything except his unhurried presence, and the boy had gone out into the world quietly determined to prove he didn't need it. And now there was no more time to do it differently. On the 40th day after Colin's funeral, Theodore Weston put on the oldest clothes he owned, folded a grey blanket under his arm, and walked to the steps of his own building. He told no one. He left his phone on the kitchen counter. He carried $40 and a notebook, but what he was really carrying, what he settled onto those cold granite steps with, was a question he needed the world to answer honestly, without the filter of his net worth distorting every interaction. Who are people when they think no one powerful is watching? He had his answer within 48 hours. The building's security, to their credit, recognized him for the first 3 days and left him alone, but by the end of the first week, new shift rotations meant new faces, and new faces saw only a grey blanket and a quiet old man, and the calls to move him along began. He let it happen. He watched who made the calls with urgency, who made them with apology, and who walked past without making them at all. He watched Victoria Channing for 6 weeks before Eleanor Briggs ever appeared on those steps. Victoria arrived every morning at 8:47, never 8:45, never 8:50, always 8:47, as though her relationship with time was another performance of control. She wore different coats, but the same expression, a finely calibrated blankness that she deployed on anyone she considered beneath her engagement. She had walked past Theodore 11 times before she noticed him enough to find him inconvenient, and on the 12th morning she had stopped, looked at him the way a person looks at a stain on a marble floor, and summoned the security guard with 2 words, "Remove that." Theodore had written 2 words in his notebook that evening, her name, but beside it he drew no conclusion yet. He was a patient man. Character, he had learned from 63 years of living, always confirms itself given enough time. And then one morning, a cold grey Thursday in August, Eleanor appeared. She came on foot, slightly breathless, in a coat that was clean but had seen better winters. She stopped at the second step, looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him, and said, "I made extra this morning. I hope you like black beans." He had looked up at her and seen something he hadn't expected to find on those steps or anywhere near that building. He had seen a person completely unperformed. No agenda behind the gesture, no calculation in the eyes, just a woman who had, apparently, decided that the fact of his hunger was sufficient reason to address it. He accepted the container with both hands. "God sees everything, child," he said quietly, but what he meant, what he was recording in the part of himself that made irreversible decisions, was something he would not speak aloud for months. He had been watching Victoria Channing destroy a woman's reputation in the elevator lobby just the previous afternoon. He had seen Eleanor's photograph in the framed company newsletter someone had discarded near the steps, seen the caption that named her as Daniel Briggs, ex-wife, read the small, cruel paragraph Victoria had apparently leaked to the internal gossip chain about Eleanor's unfortunate circumstances. But Theodore Weston had not built a $70 billion company by reacting quickly to anything. He watched, he waited. He let Eleanor feed him every morning for 3 months, never revealing himself, never disrupting the purity of her kindness by introducing the complication of his identity. But he filled that notebook with observations that would, in time, become something far more consequential than notes. He filled it with a plan. And on the morning, Eleanor arrived at those steps with a gold-embossed wedding invitation folded in her coat pocket, her hands steadier than they had any right to be, her eyes carrying that particular clarity of a woman who had finished grieving and started thinking. Theodore looked at her for a long moment after she handed him his breakfast. "Are you going?" he asked quietly. It was the first personal question he had ever directed at her. She looked at him with something between surprise and exhaustion. "I don't know," she said honestly, but her jaw said otherwise. Her jaw said she had already decided, she just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. Theodore nodded slowly and looked back toward the glass tower, but his eyes were not seeing the building. He was already making a phone call in his mind, to a number only 4 people in the world had, to a woman who had been waiting 6 months for exactly this kind of news. Eleanor did not see him reach, slowly and deliberately, into the grey blanket and retrieve a phone that no homeless man should have owned. She was already walking away, her worn shoes carrying her back toward Greystone Avenue, back toward the shelter, back toward the cot, where a gold invitation was waiting to be answered. She did not know that by the time she reached the shelter's front door, Theodore Weston had already dialed. But the woman who answered on the second ring had been waiting for this call since the day her son changed the locks. Margaret Briggs had not spoken to her son in 6 months, but she had not been silent. She lived in a quiet house in Asheville, North Carolina. With a garden she tended with the same methodical patience she had applied to everything in her 71 years of living. But the morning Daniel had called to tell her he was marrying Victoria Channing, she had set the phone down on the kitchen counter mid-sentence, walked to her garden, pulled every weed she could find with her bare hands, and then come back inside and booked a one-way flight that she later changed to a return, because leaving permanently, she decided, was too clean an exit for what she was feeling. What she was feeling was a specific kind of maternal grief that has no public language, the grief of watching a child you raised with intention become a person you don't recognize, of seeing the values you planted get quietly uprooted by someone who saw your son not as a human being to love, but as a resource to position herself beside. She had met Victoria Channing exactly once, a dinner Daniel had arranged with the careful staging of a man who needed his mother's approval but had already decided he wouldn't be governed by it. Victoria had arrived 20 minutes late, apologized to Daniel only, and spent the evening speaking exclusively about things that established her superiority, her title, her salary, her circle, the places she had traveled, the people she knew. But she had never once asked Margaret a single question. Not one. She had looked at Daniel's mother the way she apparently looked at everyone she categorized as beneath her, with a politeness so thin it was almost more insulting than open dismissal. Margaret had driven home that night and called Eleanor. "I don't know what's coming," she had told her daughter-in-law, "but I want you to know that whatever it is not a reflection of your worth. Do you hear me? Not one syllable of it." 3 weeks later, Eleanor was on a shelter cot. Margaret had arrived at the shelter on a Tuesday unannounced, with a casserole dish and the particular expression of a woman who had decided that casseroles were the only socially acceptable way to deliver rage. She had sat beside Eleanor's cot and held her hands and said nothing for a long time, because sometimes the most honest thing a person can offer is the willingness to sit inside someone else's pain without trying to renovate it into something more comfortable. But Margaret Briggs was not only a woman of comfort, she was a woman of action, and in the 5 months since that shelter visit, she had been quietly, methodically, doing what she did best. She had been finding things out. She had a friend, Dolores, 73, former corporate paralegal, with a memory like a steel filing cabinet and a network of retired professional women who between them had worked in nearly every significant institution in the city. Dolores had spent 30 years at the kind of law firms that handled the affairs of the extraordinarily wealthy, and when Margaret described Victoria Channing and Hargrove and Stone over the phone, Dolores had gone very quiet in a way that meant she was already searching her mental archives. "Hargrove and Stone," Dolores had repeated slowly. "You know who owns that company, don't you?" Margaret had not known, but she had written the name down the moment Dolores said it, Theodore Weston, and spent the following week reading everything she could find, which was considerable, and then suddenly nothing, because 3 years ago Theodore Weston had vanished from public life as completely as a stone dropped into deep water. She had filed that name in the back of her mind like a held card. But then, on a cold November morning, her phone had rung, a number she didn't recognize. She had answered out of the instinct of a woman who had learned that important things rarely announced themselves in advance. "Mrs. Briggs," the voice had said, calm, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "My name is Theodore Weston. I believe we have a mutual friend on Greystone Avenue, and I believe we may have some interests in common regarding a wedding on the 14th. Margaret had sat down slowly in her garden chair. "Mr. Weston," she said, but her voice was steadier than her heartbeat. "I have been waiting for this phone call for 5 months. I just didn't know it was yours." What followed was a conversation that lasted 47 minutes, but changed the trajectory of everything that came after it. Theodore spoke carefully and Margaret listened with the precision of a woman assembling something that needed to be built exactly right. He told her what he had observed. She told him what she had discovered. He told her what he was considering. She told him what she was prepared to do. But it was the last thing Theodore said, quietly, almost to himself, as though he was confirming a decision he had already made in the deepest part of his conscience, that made Margaret press her free hand flat against her chest. "Your former daughter-in-law," he said, "fed me every morning for 3 months without ever asking what I could do for her. In my experience, Mrs. Briggs, that kind of character is either rewarded or it is wasted, and I have spent enough of my life watching it be wasted." Margaret had closed her eyes, but not from sadness. From recognition, because Eleanor had always been that person, had always been the woman who fed the hungry without calculating the return, who gave without performing the giving, who loved without installing conditions, and Daniel had looked at all of that and called it smallness, and Victoria Channing had looked at it and called it weakness, and the world had largely agreed with both of them. But Theodore Weston, a man who had built $70 billion on his ability to identify what was real versus what was performed, had sat on cold granite steps for 3 months and arrived at a completely different conclusion. He had concluded that Eleanor Briggs was precisely the kind of person that extraordinary things should happen to, but extraordinary things rarely happened on their own. Sometimes they needed to be arranged. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her garden, the careful rows, the patient tending, the faith that what you put into the ground would eventually come up. "Tell me what you need from me, Mr. Weston," she said. "A companion for the flight," he said simply. "I find I don't like arriving at important occasions alone." Margaret had smiled then, the particular smile of a woman who had been waiting 6 months for something worth dressing up for. She booked her flight to New York that evening, but it was not a commercial flight. Theodore Weston had already sent the details, a private terminal, a Saturday morning departure, timed with the precision of a man who understood that arrival, like everything else, was a statement. She had one thing left to do before she packed. She called Eleanor. Not to explain, not to prepare her, but simply to say, in the voice she had used when Daniel was small and the world felt too large, "Eleanor, I need you to go to that wedding. Will you trust me?" There was a long silence on the other end, but it was not the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of a woman who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to tell her that showing up was not defeat, that walking into that room on that day was not surrender but arrival. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "I'll go." She did not know about the jet. She did not know about Theodore Weston's suit, or the plan, or the 47-minute phone call, or the notebook filled with 3 months of careful observation. She did not know that the homeless man she had fed every morning had made one phone call that set in motion something so precise and so perfectly timed that when it landed, it would feel, as Margaret would later describe it to Dolores over the phone, like God showing off. But the 14th was 3 days away. And in the glass tower on Meridian Avenue, Victoria Channing was finalizing seating arrangements for a wedding she believed she had already won. The Grand Callaway Hotel had been dressed for a celebration, but it had not been dressed for what was coming. White orchids lined every surface. Champagne towers caught the afternoon light and threw it across the walls in scattered gold. 300 guests moved through the marble lobby in designer clothes and careful conversation, the kind of crowd that attended weddings not purely out of affection, but out of the social arithmetic of being seen in the right room at the right time. Victoria Channing had curated the guest list with the same precision she applied to everything, every seat filled with someone who reflected well on her, every table arranged to reinforce the narrative she had spent 2 years constructing around herself and Daniel Briggs. Daniel stood near the altar in a charcoal suit, cufflinks catching the light. Wearing the expression of a man who had made a decision he had fully committed to and was no longer interested in examining. He looked successful, he looked certain, but there was a moment, just one, barely a flicker, when his eyes moved to the entrance doors with something that was not quite anticipation and not quite dread, and the man standing beside him, his best man and college roommate, noticed it and said nothing, because some things between old friends are communicated entirely in silence. Eleanor had arrived 20 minutes earlier. She had come alone, in a dress Margaret had quietly arranged to be delivered to the shelter 3 days prior, deep navy, simple, well-cut, the kind of dress that did not announce itself but was impossible to ignore once noticed. She had sat in the 3rd row from the back, on the aisle seat, with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight, and the guests around her had glanced at her with the vague recognition of people who knew they should place a face but couldn't quite locate the file. But nobody had approached her. There was something in Eleanor's stillness that discouraged casual interruption, the stillness not of submission, but of a woman who had decided, completely and finally, who she was. Victoria had swept past her during the pre-ceremony processional without a glance, but she had not yet been told Eleanor was in attendance. Daniel had sent the invitation in a moment of cruelty so reflexive he had almost immediately regretted it, and had since convinced himself she wouldn't come, because the Eleanor he remembered would have been too wounded, too diminished, too broken by the preceding 6 months to walk voluntarily into this room. He had fundamentally misread what 6 months of real life does to a woman of real character, but that misreading was about to be corrected in front of 300 witnesses. The ceremony had been scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock. At 1:53, a sound moved through the lobby that was difficult to categorize, not loud, not dramatic, but the particular atmospheric shift that happens when something enters a room that recalibrates every instinct in it simultaneously. 300 people did not turn their heads because of noise. They turned because of weight, the specific gravitational quality of two people walking through a door who between them carried something the room had no existing framework to process. Theodore Weston had not worn grey. He wore a suit the color of midnight, perfectly fitted, no pocket square, no excess, just the absolute confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to any room he entered. He walked with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who owned not just the moment, but the building's mortgage. But it was not his suit or his bearing that first stopped the room. It was Margaret Briggs walking beside him in a deep burgundy dress, her silver hair pinned with the precision of a woman who had prepared for this moment the way generals prepare for the final decisive engagement, completely, without sentiment, with the calm of someone who knows exactly how it ends. She was the mother of the groom, but she had arrived on a billionaire's jet, with a man no one in this room had seen coming, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a mother arriving to celebrate her son's wedding. It was the expression of a woman arriving to tell the truth. The ripple moved through the room in stages. First, the guests nearest the door, a collective intake of breath, a leaning toward neighbors, a rapid whispered exchange. Then the wedding planner, whose clipboard dropped 2 inches before she caught it. Then the best man, who saw Margaret first and touched Daniel's arm without speaking, because his hands knew before his brain did that something had fundamentally changed in the room. Daniel turned. He saw his mother, but his mother was not what stopped him. She was not what drained the color from his face in a single second and left him standing at that altar looking like a man who had just watched the floor become glass beneath his feet. It was the man beside her. Daniel Briggs had seen Theodore Weston's face exactly once, in a framed portrait in the executive conference room on the 42nd floor of Hargrove and Stone. On the day he had visited Victoria at the office, and she had walked him through the building with the proprietary pride of a woman showing off something she believed she owned. The portrait was large, oil-painted, hung above the fireplace in a room that smelled of leather and consequence, and beneath it, a small brass plate that read, Theodore Weston, founder. The man in that portrait was now standing 20 feet away from him in a midnight suit, beside his mother, in the wedding venue he had chosen, on the day he had selected, at the time Victoria had insisted upon. Daniel made a sound that was not a word, but his body made the decision his voice couldn't, one small involuntary step backward, as though the ground ahead had become uncertain. And then Victoria saw him. She had been standing in the bridal anteroom when her coordinator appeared in the doorway with an expression that violated every professional boundary the woman had maintained across 11 years of wedding planning. Victoria had followed her into the doorway. She had looked out at the room. She had seen the crowd's altered energy, the turned heads, the whispered urgency, the particular quality of attention that meant something had arrived that no one had planned for. And then she had seen Theodore Weston. The color did not drain from Victoria Channing's face gradually. It left all at once, a sudden, total departure, like a power outage in a building that had believed its lights were permanent, because she recognized him. She recognized him from the portrait, yes, but she recognized him from something more immediate, more damning, more irreversible than a painted portrait in a conference room. She recognized him from the granite steps outside the building. She recognized the eyes. The quiet, watchful, infinitely patient eyes that she had looked past every single morning for 6 weeks. The eyes above the gray blanket she had ordered security to remove. The eyes belonging to the man she had described, on a Tuesday morning with a perfectly manicured wave of her hand, as bad for the company's image. She had said that to his security team, about him, about the man who signed their paychecks, about the man who owned the building, the company, the image she had claimed to be protecting. What Victoria Channing did next was, as everyone who witnessed it would later confirm, unthinkable. She sat down on the floor of the bridal anteroom, not dramatically, not in tears, but with the slow, folding collapse of a person whose entire structural support has been removed simultaneously, knees first, then sideways, her designer dress spreading around her on the marble like a curtain coming down. Her coordinator reached for her, but Victoria did not reach back. She sat on that floor with both hands flat on the marble and stared at a point in the middle distance that contained, apparently, the full inventory of every decision she had made in the last 2 years. The wedding did not proceed. But what happened instead was something none of the 300 guests would ever fully agree on in the retelling, because memory, when overwhelmed, tends to fragment into the details that mattered most personally to the person holding them. What everyone agreed on was Margaret. She had walked, not hurried, not swept, walked down the center aisle of that wedding venue with Theodore Weston beside her, past 300 people who parted without being asked, until she reached the altar where her son stood in his charcoal suit, with his cufflinks catching the light and his face holding the expression of a man finally, completely, and irreversibly understanding the full cost of what he had done. She had stopped 2 feet in front of him. She had looked at him for a long moment, the look of a mother who has loved a child through every version of himself and is now meeting a version she had prayed would not arrive. But she did not look away. She was not a woman who looked away. And then she had spoken, quietly, slowly, in the voice she had used when he was small, and had done something that required not punishment but understanding of why it mattered. The room had gone so still that the orchids seemed to be listening. "Daniel," she said, "Eleanor fed this man every morning for 3 months when she had almost nothing, and he flew here today to show you what that means. I flew here today to show you what you threw away. What you do with this moment is the last decision of this kind I will watch you make." Daniel Briggs said nothing, but his eyes moved past his mother, past Theodore Weston, across the 300 guests who had come to celebrate a wedding, until they found Eleanor in the 3rd row from the back, in a navy dress, with her spine very straight and her hands folded in her lap. She was looking directly at him, but not with anger, not with triumph, with the particular expression of a woman who has completed something, who has walked into the room she was afraid of and discovered that it had no power over her anymore. Theodore Weston reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small envelope, cream-colored, no embossing, sealed with quiet intention, and placed it in Eleanor's hands as he passed her row. He said nothing, but the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who had been conducting a conversation for 3 months without words and had just arrived at its natural conclusion. She opened it later, alone, back at the shelter, sitting on her cot, still in the navy dress. Inside was a business card, and behind it, a handwritten note in the careful, deliberate script of a man who chose words the way he chose everything, with full awareness of their weight. "There is a position at Hargrove and Stone that has needed the right person for 3 years. The salary is attached on the reverse. The office has a good window. T.W." Eleanor sat with that note for a long time. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent, relentless, gloriously unaware of what had just happened inside the Grand Callaway Hotel. But Eleanor Briggs was aware. She was aware of every single thread of it: the trash bag, the shelter cot, the cold granite steps, the black beans, the grey blanket, the gold invitation, the navy dress, the midnight suit, the look on Daniel's face, the words Margaret had spoken into that silenced room, and the small cream envelope now resting in her hands. She pressed it flat against her chest, the way you hold something you don't want to put down, the way you hold something that has confirmed, after a long season of doubt, that the life you were living was not the life you were meant for, and that the difference between the two was never really about what you had. It was always about who you were when you had nothing. She looked at the business card one more time. Then she set it carefully on the cot beside her, lay back, and for the first time in 6 months, Eleanor Briggs closed her eyes without bracing for the morning. Because the morning, for the first time in a very long time, was something she was looking forward to. "God sees everything, child." Theodore Weston Granite Steps, Meridian Avenue. Moral lessons from the story. 1. Kindness is never wasted. It is always witnessed by the right person at the right time. Eleanor fed a homeless man with almost nothing in her hands, and that single act of consistent, unperformed kindness became the seed of her complete restoration. 2. Arrogance always builds the instrument of its own destruction. Victoria Channing's cruelty was so precise, so documented, so witnessed, that when the reckoning came, she had personally handed it every tool it needed. 3. The people who walk away from you in silence are often the ones who see the most. Margaret Briggs said nothing for 6 months, but she was never still. Quiet is not the same as inactive, and a mother's love, properly directed, is one of the most powerful forces in any room. 4. Character is only truly revealed in how you treat those who can do nothing for you. Theodore Weston built $70 billion on this single principle, and it never failed him. 5. What looks like your lowest season is often your most important one. The shelter, the cot, the worn shoes, the trash bag, none of it was the end of Eleanor's story. It was the soil.